Have you ever watched a story set in a world with other kinds of intelligent beings? Elves, hobbits, aliens, talking apes? Creatures that are almost human but not quite? Most of us assume those kinds of worlds belong purely to imagination. But what if those worlds are less about imagination and actually more like an ancient memory? Because there is a chapter of human history that almost nobody is taught. For most of the time our species has existed, we were not the only kind of human on Earth. This is the story of that world. The other kinds of humans who lived beside us at certain points in history. What happened when they disappeared. And what that lost world may have left behind in the human mind. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest in Europe about 45,000 years ago. You have been walking for days. The land is colder than anything you have known before. The trees sparse and wind-bent, the ground hard underfoot in a way the soil of Africa never was. Then you smell smoke, not from your people, from someone else's fire. You already know what that means. Your elders have told stories about what lives in these forests, beings that look something like you, but not quite. Different bodies, different voices. Now you have found them, or they have found you. Moments like this happened many times across the ancient world, because for most of the time our species has existed, roughly 300,000 years, we were not alone. The planet held several kinds of humans at once. Not different cultures or skin colors, different species of humans, about as different as wolves and coyotes, but close enough to recognize each other, close enough sometimes to have children together. Africa was the engine of this diversity. Over hundreds of thousands of years, it repeatedly produced new forms of humanity. Sometimes the climate opened paths out of the continent. When the Sahara turned green, which it did many times as the Earth's orbit slowly shifted, grasslands and lakes spread across what is now desert. In those periods, humans could move north into the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. But each new wave was not entering an empty world. Other kinds of humans were already there, at least 8 that we know of, and traces of many more we have never found. The species we know the most about are the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals were already ancient when we arrived. They had been living across Europe and Western Asia for nearly 400,000 years. Through ice ages that buried half the continent, the rise and disappearance of enormous animals that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. When our ancestors were still learning to survive the African savanna, Neanderthals were already veterans of a world so harsh it is difficult to fully picture. A frozen European steppe stretching in every direction under a white sky. Woolly mammoths in the distance, moving slowly, their curved tusks catching the light. Cave lions on the open plain. Giant elk, their antlers spanning 12 feet across. Somewhere nearby, a cave bear, bigger than any bear alive today, sleeping in the rock shelter your group needs for tonight. And somewhere in that same world, a group of Neanderthals preparing to hunt. They hunted differently from us. Modern humans eventually developed weapons that could kill large animals from a distance. Neanderthals hunted up close with handheld spears. Neanderthal remains show the cost of this strategy. Broken ribs, crushed vertebrae, damaged shoulders and arms. The closest pattern researchers can find today appears in professional rodeo riders. people who spend their lives in violent proximity to animals that weigh thousands of pounds. Neanderthals were built for that life. Most stood between 5 and 5.5 feet tall, but their bodies were far heavier and much more muscular than ours. Their chests were broad and their limbs compact, with shorter forearms and shins, traditionally explained as adaptations to cold, but possibly also for sprinting. Fast twitch muscles, a powerful respiratory system, heel geometry that favored explosive acceleration. Modern humans are endurance hunters. We run prey down over miles. Neanderthals seem to have been ambush hunters who closed the distance fast. Some researchers estimate they may have been 3 times as strong as the average modern human, but a body like that burns enormous energy. Neanderthals may have needed nearly triple the calories we do simply to stay alive. Their faces looked different from ours as well. A heavy brow ridge framed the eyes. The forehead sloped backward. The chin that defines the modern human face was small or absent, and their most prominent feature was their large and projecting nose, an adaptation that helped warm freezing air before it reached the lungs. Genetic evidence suggests dark skin and brown eyes, though variation across populations may have included lighter tones in some regions. Their hair color is genuinely uncertain, perhaps brown and sometimes red. Their brains were actually larger than ours. Neanderthal skulls reveal subtle differences in brain organization. Their occipital lobes, the regions associated with visual processing, were proportionally larger than ours. They were adapted for activity in low-light conditions, dimmer environments, shorter winter days, the kind of hunting that happens at dusk or in the gray half-dark before dawn. They appear to have devoted more neural resources to processing movement, navigating landscapes, and interpreting complex visual environments, tracking animals across rugged terrain, reading small changes in landscapes, manipulating stone tools with precision. These were cognitive domains in which Neanderthals seem to have been extraordinarily capable. At the same time, they appear to have less capacity available for the highly interconnected social networks that dominate the modern human brain. The systems that allow individuals to track many relationships at once, interpret subtle social cues, and navigate large cooperative groups. And yet, their world was not one of isolated individuals struggling alone. Neanderthals lived in small, tightly connected communities, perhaps 100 people within a wider social network. They used pigments to paint their bodies. They buried their dead. Some individuals survived severe injuries for years after wounds that would have made hunting impossible, evidence that others cared for them long after they could no longer contribute. Life was hard. Roughly 90% of Neanderthals were dead before the age of 40. Their bodies matured faster than ours, an adaptation to a life where reaching old age was rare. And then we walked into their world. The first meeting did not happen in frozen Europe. It happened much farther south, in the Levant, the narrow corridor connecting Africa and Eurasia. Around 130,000 years ago, the region was warm and wet. Grasslands stretched across what is now desert. Hippos moved through river valleys. Antelope grazed open plains. For roughly 50,000 years, Neanderthals and modern humans occupied the region intermittently. They hunted the same animals. They used nearly identical stone tools. They both buried their dead with red ochre, and sometimes they had children together. Eventually, modern humans retreated south again, and the Levant returned to being Neanderthal territory. The second encounter came much later, around 54,000 years ago, when modern humans appeared in Europe in what seems to have been a small early incursion. What happened in those meetings we do not fully know. The third and final encounter began around 45,000 years ago, when modern humans spread across Europe in earnest. For several thousand years, the two species shared the same landscapes, the same rivers, the same hunting grounds, the same forests and plains. They traded, watched each other, and had children together again. While Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia, a related human population was living much farther east, the Denisovans. Most of what we know about them comes from genetics. Their DNA appears in people whose ancestors lived across a huge swath of Asia. From cold northern mountain ranges to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia and the islands of the Pacific, and even on the Tibetan Plateau. Those environments are physiologically extreme in completely different ways. Northern Asia means brutal winters and long periods of cold. Tropical Southeast Asia means intense heat, humidity, dense forests, and entirely different animal and plant worlds. The Tibetan Plateau means thin air, roughly half the oxygen found at sea level. Our own species would not successfully occupy all of those environments until roughly 100,000 years after the Denisovans were mastering them 160,000 years ago. Which means they were not just surviving in one narrow ecological niche. They were solving very different environmental problems across enormous distances. Physically, they were close relatives of Neanderthals, powerful, heavily built, dark-haired, and dark-eyed. The one skull we have for them is the longest archaic human skull ever found, with the widest brow ridge of any known human species, a broad flat face, and teeth so large they more closely resemble species from millions of years earlier. Some reconstructions of Denisovan brain organization suggest the regions associated with emotional bonding and group continuity may have been particularly developed. What they left behind is sparse but striking. In a cave in Siberia, a bracelet carved from dark green stone, polished to a smoothness that required drilling techniques our species would not develop for another 50,000 years. Bone tools, ivory pendants, needles for stitching fitted clothing. These objects suggest something beyond brute endurance in harsh environments. They point to fine motor control, careful craftsmanship, and the possibility of ornamentation or symbolic display. In Denisova Cave, scientists also identified the bones of a teenage girl who lived roughly 90,000 years ago. Her DNA showed that her mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovan. She was a direct hybrid child of two different human species. Her existence tells us something important. These were not completely separate worlds. They met, recognized each other across whatever difference lay between them, and sometimes chose each other. And they were not the only ones. Beyond the Neanderthals and Denisovans, the fossil record offers glimpses of other human kinds, less complete, sometimes just fragments, but enough to know they were there. On the Indonesian island of Flores, evolution had been running its own strange experiment for hundreds of thousands of years. Isolated by ocean, cut off from the flow of genes and competition that shaped mainland populations, the humans there had shrunk. Adults stood about 3.5 feet tall. Their feet were enormous relative to their bodies, wide, flat, disproportionate in a way that struck researchers immediately when the skeletons were uncovered, which is partly why they ended up being called the hobbits in both popular writing and academic literature. Just reaching the island would have required crossing open water, which means their ancestors were already capable of some form of seafaring. The island they lived on had distorted-sized animals along with them. The elephants were cow-sized, the rodents were dog-sized, and the hobbits hunted both, coordinating kills with stone tools on an island they also shared with Komodo dragons and storks nearly 6 feet tall, birds large enough to swallow a small hobbit whole. On a nearby Philippine island, a handful of bones from another small isolated species, Homo luzonensis, suggest the same island forces were at work there too. A different lineage, a different island, the same compression. Back in Africa, another human shared the landscape with our earliest ancestors. Homo naledi was small, lightly built, with hands and feet that looked surprisingly modern, but shoulders and hips built for climbing. Half-tree creature, half-ground dweller. Their brains were tiny, about a third the size of yours, but they were burying their dead deep inside the rising star cave system and making geometric markings on the walls. In the Levant, that crossroads corridor between Africa and Eurasia, fragments from a site called Nesher Ramla suggest a population carrying traits of both Neanderthals and Denisovans, a living genetic bridge between two lineages, evidence that the mixing had been going on long before we arrived. On Java, the last known survivors of Homo erectus, a species that had walked the earth for nearly 2 million years, held on until roughly 110,000 years ago, before their grassland habitat was swallowed by expanding tropical forest. They were the one species that seemed to have disappeared before we met them. And in the caves of southwest China, a population with thick brow ridges, broad faces, and ancient-looking features survived until roughly 14,500 years ago, recent enough that agriculture was already beginning elsewhere in the world. The Red Deer Cave people are the last known echo of the archaic world, still present at the edge of recorded human history. Those are the 8 archaic human species scientists have been able to formally identify from fossils. But the fossil record is only part of the story. Over the past 2 decades, scientists have begun scanning the DNA of living people, looking for traces of ancient interbreeding. And the same pattern appears repeatedly. Fragments of ancestry that match none of the humans we know. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovans, not any species that has left a recognizable fossil. Just patterns in living DNA that say something else was here. Researchers call it ghost DNA. Across the broader human family tree, scientists have proposed more than 30 distinct human species. The true number of humankinds that have walked this earth, met each other, and disappeared may never be fully known. West African populations carry genetic signals from an unknown human lineage that split from the main human line roughly 1 million years ago. Tibetans carry traces of ancestry from a deeply divergent population that does not match any known fossil species. People across parts of Asia and Oceania carry fragments of DNA labeled simply extinct hominin 1 and extinct hominin 2, placeholders for humans we cannot yet identify. Europeans, West Asians, South Asians, and North Africans carry ancestry from an unknown group of early modern humans that split from the main non-African population between 60,000 and 100,000 years ago, then merged back in later. Native Americans carry traces of another ancient population linked to early humans who once lived in what is now southern China. Virtually every human population on Earth, when examined closely enough, carries something from somewhere unexpected, which suggests something profound about the ancient world. It was not empty. It was crowded with the different populations of human species meeting, mixing, separating, and meeting again over hundreds of thousands of years. But that would not last forever. The disappearances of other human kinds begin after modern humans start expanding out of Africa in a sustained way. Earlier members of our species had left Africa before, reaching places like the Levant and perhaps farther into Eurasia. But those earlier movements seem to have been limited and temporary. Then, between about 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, something changed. Modern humans began spreading outward in larger numbers and holding the territories they entered. They moved through the Levant into Western Asia. They spread across Southern Asia. Some reached the islands of Southeast Asia and crossed open water into the ancient landmass that joined Australia and New Guinea. Others pushed north and west into Europe. As they expanded, they entered a world already occupied by other kinds of humans. And one by one, as modern humans arrived in each region, over the tens of thousands of years that followed, those other populations disappeared from the fossil record. The pattern does not suggest a single war or a single cause. It looks more like a long demographic shift unfolding under difficult conditions. The climate of this period was unstable. Between about 70,000 and 15,000 years ago, temperatures and rainfall shifted repeatedly. Forests expanded and retreated. Grasslands moved. Animal populations followed those changes. A group that had lived successfully in one landscape for thousands of years could suddenly find that landscape altered. Small populations are fragile in a world like that. A few harsh seasons, the loss of a hunting range, disease, or simple bad luck can push a group into decline. Around 74,000 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption in Southeast Asia may have added to that instability. Some researchers think it created a severe bottleneck in human populations. A bottleneck does not eliminate every population, but it reshapes the survivors. Small groups become scattered across large landscapes, and their ability to recover depends on social cooperation, mobility, and the capacity to adapt to changing conditions. Some may emerge stronger through it, some weaker. The modern human population may have emerged with certain advantages it brought with it as it expanded into a more fragile world. Modern human social networks appear to have been larger. Their technologies were more flexible. Innovations could spread farther and faster, instead of remaining trapped within one small group. Over time, that means better tools, better clothing, better ways of hunting, and better odds of recovering after a bad year. When modern humans expanded into territories already inhabited by archaic humans, some groups probably avoided one another. Some likely fought. Some formed relationships and had children together. But when a smaller population repeatedly mixes with a larger and faster-growing one, the smaller population can slowly disappear into it. And when a smaller population is also competing with a larger one for food, territory, and recovery after climate shocks, The process speeds up. Humans didn't necessarily wipe the others out in a single violent conquest, but a species with larger alliances, faster cultural exchange, and coordinated group behavior tends to win over thousands of years. This is what disappearance can look like without a massacre. A lineage thins generation by generation. Some of its members die. Some are pushed into smaller and less favorable habitats. Some are absorbed into the newcomers through interbreeding. Some simply fail to recover from the next bad winter, the next drought, the next loss of prey. The process takes centuries, then millennia. The slight advantages of one group become amplified over time, and then eventually the distinct population is gone. But the disappearance was never complete. Pieces of those other humans are still reflected in the biology and patterns of the modern human mind. If your ancestry lies outside sub-Saharan Africa, some fraction of your genome, between 1 and 6%, likely comes from Neanderthals, Denisovans, or both. These fragments are small and scattered across the genome, but some of them still influence how the modern human body and mind work. Certain Neanderthal-derived variants influence the human circadian rhythm, nudging the body toward later activity, evening wakefulness, and daytime rest. People who carry them are slightly more likely to be evening types, a pattern that fits a species adapted to low-light conditions, shorter winter days, and hunting in the dimmer hours. Archaic inheritances also helped humans survive extreme environments. Denisovan ancestry allows Tibetans to function at altitudes that would sicken most humans, and shapes body fat distribution for better cold endurance in Inuit populations. Neanderthal and Denisovan immune variants introduced pathogen defenses that many people still carry today. Some of what they left behind reaches further into how the modern brain is wired. Neanderthal cognition ran deep rather than broad, deeply powerful within specific domains, but less ability in managing large social networks or reading social cues. Fragments of that architecture still appear in modern populations. Certain Neanderthal-derived variants influence neural development and dopamine signaling, and today show statistical associations with traits such as ADHD, impulsivity, novelty-seeking, nicotine dependence, and alcoholism, patterns linked to differences in how the brain's reward and motivation systems respond to stimulation. Other archaic variants affecting neuronal connectivity, some inherited from Neanderthals and others from Denisovans, appear more frequently in people with autism spectrum traits. Some of what gets called cognitive difference today may be the re-emergence of a different but complete cognitive style, one that was functional and sophisticated in the minds that originally carried it, surfacing now in a world that wasn't built for it. Some reconstructions of the Denisovan brain suggest differences in regions of the prefrontal cortex involved in emotional regulation, social bonding, and long-term planning. If those reconstructions are even partly correct, Denisovan cognition may have placed strong emphasis on stable group bonds and continuity across generations. That possibility becomes intriguing when considered alongside the environments where Denisovans appear to have lived. Many Denisovan populations occupied landscapes where groups remained tied to the same territories for extremely long periods. Mountain ranges, dense forests, and island archipelagos where survival depended on remembering the rhythms of a specific place. In such settings, knowledge accumulates slowly and must be carried forward collectively. Memory becomes distributed across the group. Identity stretches beyond the individual and into continuity of the group through time. And across much of Eastern Asia and the Pacific, many cultural traditions emphasize ancestors, lineage continuity, and collective responsibility across generations. The human brain is extraordinarily sensitive to differences in how people look. It sorts faces rapidly, tracks who belongs and who does not, and reacts emotionally to signals of familiarity or threat. And that sensitivity appears very early in life. By about 3 months of age, infants raised in racially uniform environments begin showing a visual preference for the kinds of faces they see most often. And between about 6 and 9 months, infants become much better at distinguishing individual faces within their familiar group, while gradually losing some ability to tell apart faces from unfamiliar groups. In this period between 6 and 9 months, many infants also begin showing what psychologists call stranger anxiety. Unfamiliar adults can trigger vigilance, clinging to caregivers, or sudden crying. The infant brain is not only learning which faces it knows best, it is also becoming cautious about the ones it does not. This reaction is often stronger when the unfamiliar face is male, a pattern some researchers interpret as a very ancient form of threat detection. The architecture behind this system is much older than modern racial categories. Other primates show similar patterns of in-group preference and stranger wariness, suggesting that the neural circuitry predates our species. But in a world full of populations that were not just different tribes, but also different kinds of humans, a brain that could rapidly notice unfamiliar human types may have carried real survival value. Interestingly, the strongest shift in infant face recognition occurs around the same age when a human baby becomes physically portable and socially viable beyond its mother. The point when an infant can survive if carried and cared for by other adults. Throughout human history, groups have sometimes captured and adopted children from rival populations. It happened during warfare, in raids, and in smaller conflicts between neighboring groups, which raises an interesting possibility, although it is entirely speculative. The early tuning of an infant's brain toward familiar human faces may not simply be about visual efficiency. It may also help anchor the child to its own social group at the moment when it becomes capable of surviving outside the immediate mother-infant bond. In a world where encounters between groups sometimes meant capture, adoption, or assimilation, quickly recognizing and bonding to familiar human types could have mattered. As children grow, the same neural systems that sort familiar faces from unfamiliar ones begin organizing the social world into something more complex. Humans do not simply recognize individuals. We very quickly learn to recognize groups. We start to mentally divide the world into us and them. Once those categories form, the brain begins reacting differently to each. Success within the group feels rewarding. And interestingly, the failure of a rival group can also feel rewarding. Neuroscientists studying this phenomenon have found that watching a competitor fail can activate the brain's ventral striatum, one of the main centers of reward processing. The same circuitry that responds to food, success, and social approval can also respond when a rival group suffers a setback. And the stronger that activation, the more likely the individual is to aggress against members of that group when given the opportunity. The brain is not just passively pleased by the rival's misfortune, it is being motivated toward further action against them. You can see this tendency in sports and politics. A person may feel a surge of excitement when their own team scores, and sometimes an equally satisfying thrill when a rival team makes a mistake or loses a game. It feels personal or even petty sometimes, but in ancestral environments, the reaction may have made grim evolutionary sense. It is a system that was built for a world where competing groups of humans, sometimes different species of humans, were a genuine existential threat. If a competing group weakened, lost resources, or disappeared, the survival prospects of one's own group improved. A mind that experienced satisfaction when rivals faltered would be motivated to continue competing. Over the last few 100,000 years, and possibly intensifying just before the great expansion out of Africa, humans appear to have undergone a process sometimes called human self-domestication. Like domesticated animals, elephants, and bonobos, modern humans show signs of reduced reactive aggression, slightly more juvenile facial structure, smaller jaws and brow ridges, and a greater tolerance for living alongside many unrelated individuals. Lower reactive aggression makes it easier for large groups to cooperate, share information, and maintain alliances across wider territories. Paradoxically, that same shift toward cooperation that helped us outcompete others also made something more calculated possible. When individuals can cooperate in larger, more stable groups, they also gain the ability to carry out planned, coordinated violence, called proactive aggression, planned raids, coalition warfare, coordinated attacks carried out by groups acting together. These forms of violence require social intelligence, language, and long-term planning. In other words, they are not the opposite of civilization. They are partly made possible by it. Another curious feature of the human mind may also reflect those encounters. Many people have experienced uncanny valley, the uneasy feeling when something appears almost human, but not quite. Today, the effect is most often discussed in relation to realistic robots or computer-generated faces, but some researchers have wondered whether the reaction has deeper roots. This sensitivity may be a very old detection system. In the distant past, noticing that a face was almost human could have mattered. Those slight differences could signal a potential pathogen risk or an unfamiliar rival group. A mind that reacted with caution to almost human faces may have carried a survival advantage. These instincts, the loyalty, the vigilance, the capacity for both cooperation and coordinated violence, were forged in a world that no longer exists. A world of other minds, other fires, other ways of being human. And even after that world ended, the brain kept behaving as though it hadn't. Even after the other humans disappeared, the human brain kept behaving as if it expected them to exist. Humanity has spent decades building instruments to search for intelligence elsewhere in the universe. Radio telescopes scan the sky for signals. Spacecraft carry messages into interstellar space. Researchers test apes, dolphins, birds, and octopuses on cognition. Governments and scientific institutions organize entire programs devoted to the question of whether other minds exist. No other species does this. The impulse may come from curiosity, but it may also come from something older. We are still looking. We just changed where we're pointing. Every culture in human history tells stories about other kinds of intelligent beings: forest people, giants, spirits in the mountains, creatures that are almost human but not quite. The details vary, but the pattern repeats again and again. Minds like ours, living just beyond the edge of the known world. Consider what we now know about oral tradition. Aboriginal Australians carry stories describing a time when the Great Barrier Reef was dry land. Specific coastlines, specific landscapes, specific events. When researchers mapped ancient sea levels using ocean floor data, those coastlines were real. The stories had preserved accurate geographic memory across more than 10,000 years. Through hundreds of generations of telling, without writing, without maps. If oral tradition can hold the shape of a coastline for 10,000 years, it is not unreasonable to ask what else it might have held. From Ireland to Hawaii, from the Cherokee Mountains of North America to the forests of the Philippines, from the traditions of sub-Saharan Africa to the islands of the Pacific, on every inhabited continent, in cultures that never met each other, people tell stories about small human-like beings living just beyond the edge of the settled world. The shared features are striking wherever you find them. They are small, knee-high to perhaps 3 feet tall. They live underground, in caves, in hollow hills, in the spaces between the human world and whatever lies beyond it. They are ancient, always described as having been there before the current inhabitants arrived. They steal things. Sometimes they steal children. They have their own language. And they are reclusive, encountered rarely, always at the margins. The fairy folk of Ireland and Scotland are said to live inside ancient mounds, which archaeologists have since identified as prehistoric burial sites and settlement remains. Whatever the fairy folk were, they were associated with places where people had actually lived before. In Hawaii, the Menehune are described as master builders who constructed fish ponds and temples at night and were gone before morning. A small ancient people who were there before the Polynesian settlers arrived, and who retreated rather than integrated. The Cherokee Yunwi Junsti are helpers and tricksters who live in caves and rocky places, who assist those who treat them with respect and punish those who don't. The Ojibwe describe the Meme-Gwesi as short, hairy beings who live near water and are rarely seen. The Nagai people of Flores, where the Hobbit hominin lived, described what they called the Ebu Gogo, translated as old gluttons, with specific physical details: small, hairy, pot-bellied, wide, flat noses, their own murmuring language. They could mimic human speech in a parrot-like way, repeating words back without fully understanding them, using mimicry to approach or confuse the humans they encountered. The Nagais say their ancestors eventually exterminated them. They tricked the Ibu Gogo into taking flammable palm fibers into their cave to make clothing. Then they set the cave alight. In the Americas, where we assumed no archaic humans had ever lived, genomic studies have now found ghost populations, a genetically distinct group in the Colombian Andes dating to 6,000 years ago, early coastal populations in Baja California, mysterious southern cone populations in Argentina and Chile, all of whom disappeared without leaving direct genetic traces in current indigenous groups. The Aleutians of the Maya, small, ancient, guardians of old places, and the Little People traditions across North and South America may be pointing at populations we haven't found yet. Or they may be the same template expressing itself wherever humans settle, because the neural architecture that produced these stories was built in a world where small, human-like beings were real. A different set of stories points in a different direction. Creatures that are not only ancient, but large and powerful. In Scandinavia, the trolls are heavy-boned and cave-dwelling, with pronounced brow ridges and broad, fleshy noses. They avoid daylight. They are the old ones, the beings who were there before humans arrived, physically powerful in ways that dwarf modern humans. The description bears an uncanny resemblance to what we know about Neanderthals, who were physically adapted to low-light conditions with enlarged visual processing areas in their brains. They lived in caves. They had pronounced brow ridges, broad projecting noses, and bodies of extraordinary power. They were in Europe for 400,000 years before modern humans arrived. They were, in the most literal sense, the old ones who were already there. In the Basque country of northern Spain, the Basahon, Lord of the Woods, is a massive hairy being of the forests and mountains. But the Basahon is not a monster. In Basque tradition, he knew the secrets of agriculture and ironworking long before humans did. The story goes that humans stole those secrets through trickery. He is remembered as a teacher, a being who had been there longer, who possessed knowledge, and from whom something was taken. In Siberia and Central Asia, traditions describe the Almas, wild men seen alone in remote mountain passes, covered in hair, with a face that is almost human but heavier, with a pronounced brow. Travelers who encountered them described beings that walked upright, used no tools, and fled from human contact. In the Himalayas, the same figure appears as the Yeti, the abominable snowman, a massive upright creature seen at high altitude, leaving footprints in the snow that are too large and too wrong to belong to any known animal, glimpsed and then gone. These traditions span thousands of miles of the exact landscapes where Denisovan populations are now known to have lived. Siberia, Central Asia, the Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayan range, and describe beings that are large, powerfully built, and always alone, always at the margins, always retreating from wherever humans have arrived. These stories also echo through some of the oldest written texts in human history. Across the ancient Near East, the Hebrew Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the mythologies of Greece and Mesopotamia, a recurring story appears. Powerful superhuman males come down and take human women. The offspring are mighty, physically extraordinary, heroes or monsters, depending on who is telling the story. The Hebrew Bible calls them Nephilim, the fallen ones, giants and men of renown. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Greek gods produced demigods of extraordinary strength from mortal mothers. The genomic record shows that interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans ran predominantly in one direction: Neanderthal men with modern human women. The offspring carried something of both. Some of those inherited traits: the physical robustness, the cold endurance, the visuospatial strength, would have made the children of those unions remarkable in ways their fully modern human peers were not. High on the Tibetan Plateau, the origin myth of the Tibetan people describes the first humans as the offspring of a gentle monkey spirit and a ferocious rock ogress. The monkey came from outside. The ogress was already there. Modern genomics tells us that Tibetans carry a gene variant from the Denisovans, who were established on the Tibetan Plateau at least 160,000 years ago that allows them to function at altitudes that would cause chronic mountain sickness in almost anyone else. Tibetans are, in a very real biological sense, the offspring of a union between newcomers and a being who was already there, already adapted, already in possession of something the newcomers needed to survive. There are other kinds of stories that don't point cleanly anywhere to known archaic populations. Across the world, in traditions that had no contact with each other, the same strange image appears: beings with feet turned backwards. In the Amazon, the Curupira is described as a small wild figure who protects the forest, whose feet face the wrong direction, so that anyone trying to follow its tracks is led away from it rather than toward it. In the Himalayas, ancient accounts describe a tribe of wild men whose feet point backwards, making it impossible to track them or know which direction they are traveling. The detail appears in South America, in Asia, in traditions separated by oceans and millennia. Some researchers suggest it may encode the uncanny gait of archaic humans who walked differently from us, or who retained an opposable big toe for climbing, producing trackways that would have looked reversed to modern human eyes. In Hindu traditions, warnings exist about beings that can take human form, but always get one thing wrong. The voice, the stories say, is always too nasal. A specific behavioral cue, preserved across thousands of years. A way of recognizing something that looks human but isn't. Something runs through these stories that is easy to miss. The troll encountered alone on a mountain road. The Yeti glimpsed once and then gone. The Ebu Gogo already reduced to one cave before their cruel extermination. The fairy folk retreated so far that encountering one had become remarkable precisely because it was so rare. These are not stories of thriving populations. They are stories of stragglers, remnants, beings encountered alone or in very small groups at the edges of the world, in the places humans hadn't yet fully reached, which is exactly what the fossil record shows. Populations thinning, retreating into less favorable habitats, holding on in remote places long after the main group was gone. The Neanderthals making their last stand in the caves of southern Spain, the Red Deer cave people persisting in the mountains of southwest China, while everything around them had already changed. Someone saw that process. Someone watched as the beings at the edge of the world became fewer and harder to find, and they told stories about what they saw. We made them the monsters, the trolls to be outwitted, the ogres to be feared, the wild men to be avoided. But they were the ones alone on the mountain. They were the ones whose world had already ended, whose people were gone. The fear in those stories ran both ways. Ours just got to be the version that survived into the telling. These are the surviving signals of a long period in which our species shared the world with other kinds of minds. The girl with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. The archaic DNA in your genome. The infant who cries at an unfamiliar face. The quiet satisfaction the brain sometimes feels when a rival fails. The stories passed down for centuries about creatures in the forest. The radio telescopes pointed toward the sky. All these pieces, examined individually, can seem scattered or accidental. But when they are placed together, they begin to outline the traces of a lost world. A world of curiosity and violence and love and survival, that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years and ended only recently enough that its marks have not yet disappeared. The other humans are gone, most likely. But the brain that learned to live alongside them is still here, and some part of it has never fully accepted that the world is this empty. That part is not wrong. It's just very, very old.